All right, this begins part 1 of chapter 6, talking about learning and performance management. So we'll begin by defining learning. As it says here, it's a change in behavior that's acquired through our experience, not something that simply happens as a result of our maturing. So where do these experiences happen? Well, in school, at home, at work, and of course with our friends. Now I want to focus on a very particular kind of learning, that which is known as operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is a system in which behavior is learned through reinforcement. So the way that you or I learn to do something, anything from reading to jumping to solving problems to giving presentation, you name it, anything, any behavior that we learn it through reinforcement, at least according to the theory of operant conditioning. Now, the key assumption underlying operant conditioning is that you and I are passive agents of our environment. As it says, our environment has a tremendous impact on us and our behavior. Now, let me be even more specific here. Basically, folks who adhere to the strictest form of operant conditioning believe that you and I don't decide things, but rather the environment determines how we will behave by selectively reinforcing the things, the behaviors that the environment prefers, and not reinforcing the things, the behaviors that the environment does not prefer. So, a couple of key propositions, sort of reiterating what I just said. Number one, a person's behavior is determined through the environment's selective reinforcement of specific behaviors, otherwise known as operant behaviors. So thinking back to when you were a child just starting school, you were reinforced for sitting forward, you were reinforced for sitting still. When it was time to get up and go to the bubbler, to the water fountain, you were reinforced for walking in a single file quietly through the hallways. So you would have been praised when you did the right thing and maybe punished when you did the bad thing. In other words, it isn't so much that you, out of all the things you could have done, chose to behave in a certain way, but rather you behaved as you did because of the way you were reinforced. The law of effect, which was put forth by a guy whose last name was Thorndike, says that people learn by repeating behaviors that are reinforced and not repeating behaviors that are not reinforced. So when we are praised, when we receive something positive in exchange for behaving a certain way, yeah, we're more likely to do that behavior again and again and again. And when we're not, we are less likely to engage in those behaviors. Another way of thinking about this, a very hedonistic perspective, again put forth by this guy you see here, Thorndike, says that you and I have a tendency to move toward pleasure and away from pain. We will do the things that bring us a positive outcome, and we will avoid those things that don't give us a positive outcome. So what specifically is reinforcement? And here you see a lovely photo of B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is probably one of the foremost minds in the theory of operant conditioning. He says that anything that both increases the strength of a response and tends to induce repetitions of the behavior that preceded the reinforcement is a reinforcement. So anything, again, it could be praise, it could be a smile, it could simply be that something feels good. Again, anything that both increases the strength of a response and tends to induce repetitions of that response. That's what a reinforcer is. So we can think in terms of both positive and negative consequences. Positive consequences are the results of a behavior that a person finds attractive or pleasurable. Now, let me drill into something really specific here. Notice that it says a person finds. Okay, the bottom line ultimately always is this. Each individual decides whether something is positive or not positive, Whether a given reinforcer is considered attractive or pleasurable is up to me. It's up to you specifically. It isn't up to the boss to decide for an employee, or for a parent to decide for a child, or for a teacher to decide for a student. Rather, the individual, the focal person, is the one who decides whether to find something attractive or pleasurable. Ditto with the negative stuff. So here it says negative is the results of a behavior that a person finds unattractive or aversive. In other words, we're trying to avoid. So aversive, think avoid. Something we don't like. Well, again, this is up to the individual. It's all a perceptual thing. So one person may find something unattractive, absolutely aversive, horrifying, and another person may find that exact same consequence to be a positive. So it's very individual. Now, some strategies for reinforcement and punishment. So we got a 2x2 here, because as you'll discover throughout the course of the semester, like everything we talk about in management practically can be drilled into a 2x2 table. So if we look at positive and negative consequences on the left in the first two rows, and reinforcement versus punishment in the two columns up top, when we apply positive consequences, we are trying to reinforce desirable behavior. So you do something well, you write a memo that is just spot on. I might choose to apply a positive consequence, something you would consider to be a positive consequence. For example, maybe you like to be praised, and so I would apply praise. I would praise you in an effort to try and get you to repeat that positive behavior. On the other hand, if I wanted to punish you for a behavior, let's say you had done something that wasn't okay. For example, you sent an email to me that was rude and didn't address me correctly and was demanding. I might choose to punish you by withholding positive consequences. One possible positive consequence would be actually responding to your email. I might choose to simply not respond to your email as a form of punishment. Going down to the row where we talk about negative consequences, when I want someone to repeat a desirable behavior, let's say a person does a terrific job leading a team and they finish a project and they do it beautifully, I might choose to withhold some negative consequences in order to encourage that same behavior in the future. For example, I might say to that person, well, I know how much you dislike having to punch in, having to sign your timesheet. So because you've done such an awesome job demonstrating your leadership, in the future, you don't need to sign that timesheet. I'm going to withhold that negative consequence. I'm going to take that negative consequence away in an effort to reinforce, to encourage what I consider to be desirable behavior. So remember, anytime we use the word reinforcement or reinforcer, we're talking about trying to encourage positive or good behavior. Positive reinforcement is when we give a positive consequence. Negative reinforcement is when we take away or withhold a negative consequence. Both of these are in exchange for the person having done something really good. Now the last cell on the lower right-hand side, punishment, negative consequences. This is sort of the standard way we think about punishment, where we apply a negative consequence. For example, we reduce someone's pay. For example, we compel someone to work a shift they don't want to work, or we force them to work with somebody they don't want to work with, or we make them repeat something that they really didn't enjoy doing in the first place. In all of these cases, what we're doing is applying or giving negative consequences in exchange for that bad behavior. We're trying to stop that bad behavior. So reinforcement, as I've said, and I'm going to say this again and again, you're going to hear this again and again because this material is so incredibly important. Reinforcement is our attempt to develop or strengthen desirable behavior by either applying positive consequences, and in that case we call it positive reinforcement, or withholding negative consequences, and in this case we call it negative reinforcement. And note, negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment. That's what people who don't know any better will say. They'll say, oh, so-and-so was negatively reinforced, when what they meant to say was that the person was punished. I think part of the reason why that phrasing, negative reinforcement, has been used incorrectly is that we often feel uncomfortable using the word punish when we talk about adults. We're okay, many people at least are okay, talking about punishing children, but not so much adults. And so what's happened in our adult language is people have incorrectly adopted the phrase negative reinforcement. I'm going to negatively reinforce that person, when what they really mean to say is, I'm going to punish that person. If they were going to negatively reinforce somebody, it would be, I'm going to take away something bad because you did something awesome, you did something great. Remember, the word reinforcement or reinforcer is always, always, always associated with the person having done something good. So obviously we wouldn't punish somebody for good behavior, right? So what is punishment? Punishment is really the attempt to eliminate or weaken undesirable behavior. And there are two ways to do this. One is we can withhold consequences, most often positive consequences, and that's what we call extinction. And the other is to apply the negative consequences, and that we're all used to calling that punishment. So let me focus on extinction for a little bit. And really the reason I want to focus on this is that because, frankly, the two options, extinction or punishment, extinction always works better. Let me repeat that. Extinction always, always, always works better. That said, it's sometimes difficult to actually engage in extinction, to use extinction, because, well, let me just explain what it is, and then I'll explain why it can be difficult to use it. So extinction is the attempt to weaken a behavior by attaching no consequences to it, in other words, to withholding, supporting consequences. And as I've written here, unsafe behavior, for example, continues to occur because something is reinforcing the behavior. In other words, if you were to ask somebody why they engage in a particular behavior, let's say an unsafe behavior, and you really wanted to understand the source, the cause of that unsafe behavior. By and large, what you would find is that the person continues to engage in the behavior, for example, texting while driving, or chatting on the phone while driving, or drinking and driving, or stealing from work, or not using their time wisely at work. All of those things, all of those negative behaviors, the reason that they happen is because ultimately people get rewarded for engaging in those behaviors. For example, the primary reason why people drink and drive is because they can. Because they get in the car, they turn the key, the car starts. Most of the time, they manage to make their way home without any incident. And so it's almost like a little sugar rush to have, I did it. And so the next time when they're placed in the same situation, they're likely to want to have that reinforcer again. So they're going to go ahead and drive even though they've had a few drinks because they can. Because the reinforcer in this situation is everything that allows them to drive, and that little rush of adrenaline, that little satisfaction, that little positive feeling that you get when, hey, I managed to pull that off. I managed to text while I was driving and I didn't get into an accident. Hooray. I managed to fill in the blank. Anything where we're engaging in what we know is a negative behavior, but we do it because, basically, again, we get reinforced for it. With extinction, then, the goal is to figure out whatever it is that's reinforcing the behavior, whatever is supporting that behavior, whatever is enabling that behavior, and take that enabler away. Take that supporter away. Take that reinforcer away. Now, this requires that you first identify the reinforcer and then you remove it. Now, obviously, this can be a real challenge, right? Again, for example, why do people drink and drive? Well, because they can. Think about all the punishments that we try in society for this. You know, we levy fines. After a certain point, we'll even imprison somebody. But that is so far away from the behavior for most of us. It's too distant. The word they use in psychology is distal. But even more significantly, I would argue, is that you and I, for the most part, don't even think about whether we're going to be punished when these things are happening. Instead, we are simply focused on why something happens and what makes it work for us, why we want to continue engaging in that behavior. It's because, again, we can. So the fact that our ignition key works, that the car starts, that we're able to drive the car home if home is where we're headed, all of those things reinforce the behavior of just going ahead and, drive ourselves home. So if we want to stop drinking and driving, all the punishment in the world probably isn't going to be the trick. Instead, probably what we need to do is make it so that it's not possible to drive your car home. It's simply not possible. So maybe there are ignition locks or some other technology that we don't yet know of that would keep us from drinking and driving. Maybe when the day comes and cars can just drive themselves to their destination without requiring us, this will be a moot point. Punishment, on the other hand, is a it can seem like a good answer because it can seem quick, and frankly, trying to figure out what's supporting a negative behavior can really be complex and difficult, and we might not be right. But in fact, the impact of punishment on behavior is very complex. I would ask you to take a few minutes and try to think of a time when punishment actually really permanently is key, modified your behavior. When did it really make, and you can pick any time in your life when you think, yep, that absolutely changed my behavior. I no longer do whatever that thing was. Now, most of you will struggle with this question. You might be able to think of an incident where you did something and you were punished and there were at least short-term changes in your behavior, but ultimately you returned to the negative behavior. The story I always tell is when I was a kid, I was raised Catholic, and every month once I was in 4th grade, once I turned 10, we went to what was called confession. And every month I came up with the same big 3 sins. They included arguing with my mom, fighting with my brothers and sisters, and, this will shock you, swearing. And every month, as I said, I returned with the same 3 sins. It was always the same deal. And every month I got the same punishment, say 3 Our Fathers and 3 Hail Marys. So I would do that. After I finished confessing my sins, I would quickly rattle off the 3 Our Fathers and the 3 Hail Marys, and then I would go home, and within a day or two I'd be right back at arguing with my mother, fighting with my brothers and sisters, and swearing. And there were some really good reasons for why the punishment just didn't work. It just didn't change my behavior. Punishment in organizations, when we're talking about adults, is problematic. Number one, because it costs a lot of money and time. Number two, and this is what I was referring to with my example from my childhood, is that the results are often short-term. So we'll observe a temporary behavior change, but not a long-term behavior change. We haven't really gotten at the source of the problem, the enabler of that bad behavior. Remember, that's where extinction comes in. We haven't really fixed the problem. And we can end up with some pretty unpleasant side effects. For example, where the employee just avoids the manager, continues to engage in the negative behavior, maybe gets even other people involved in the negative behavior because maybe they conclude that the punishment that was forced upon the person wasn't fair. So they side with the person who's being punished. There are, of course, always ethical questions associated with using punishment. Is it really ethical, for example, to deprive someone of their salary, maybe because they didn't sign their timesheet a certain way? These are the kinds of things that, as responsible managers, we need to be thinking about. Now, sometimes punishment is absolutely spot on. It's the thing that should happen. For example, natural learning is the case where punishment results from just the activity. In other words, it's not imposed by people. And as a result, there aren't very many psychological side effects. A good example would be when most people are learning to ride a bike. A natural form of punishment that they will often endure is that they'll fall off their bike while they're trying to learn how to balance, and maybe they'll scrape their knee, or they could even break something. That's a form of natural learning. So they get back on that bike and now they try to balance a little bit differently. They try to sit a little bit differently. They go a little bit faster or a little bit slower, or they try to ride on a straightaway or maybe even on a hill. But it's learning that happens as a natural outcome of some punishment that was associated with the activity, not caused by a person. The other reality is that sometimes alternatives aren't feasible. For example, if a person is engaged in a highly unsafe behavior at work, then sometimes rather than taking the time to try and ferret out, well, what is enabling this behavior, and trying to use extinction, we just need to remove the person from the situation immediately. We have to immediately change their behavior. And so in those cases, we may use punishment. Now, when we do, we have to follow the following. We have to observe some conditions if we want it to actually work. And remember what that means. That means we want it to last for the long term, not just a short-term fix, not something that just changes a person's behavior for the day, but something that changes the person's behavior permanently. So there are some conditions that need to be met, and these parallel the characteristics of a hot stove. You know what I'm talking about here. If you were to accidentally put your hand on a hot burner, that would feel very punishing. And you would immediately remove, at least most of us anyway, you would immediately remove your hand from the hot stove. So let's see what the conditions are. Number one, the punishment has to be swift. It has to be applied immediately at the time of the undesirable behavior. So a person engages in something very unsafe at work, something that could cause them or a coworker to be badly injured or even killed. You might, at that moment, immediately send that person home. Immediately deprive that person of his or her wages for the rest of the day or even the week, so that the person gets that, oh my God, this is a big deal. So it happens immediately. The thought of someone losing their wages for the rest of the day or the week, that's pretty intense for most people. And it needs to be, because what we're trying to do is really put at the forefront of the person's mind that this particular behavior is not okay and you must never repeat it. So again, the punishment has to be swift, it has to be intense. It also has to be consistent. It can't be that one person who engages in the inappropriate behavior is punished one way and another person is punished another way. Whenever that happens, you can guarantee the punishment is not going to work. Then we've got to talk to the person about what the appropriate behavior is. We have to introduce that behavior. This is what you should be doing instead of what you were doing, okay? Now that you understand that what you were doing is really not okay, it could cause, again, injury, a fatality, something like that. Here's what I want you to do instead. Then when the person engages in that new behavior, we want to reinforce it. We want to support it. We want to enable it. It doesn't hurt, by the way, this last point is before someone engages in a behavior that's not okay, to tell them why they shouldn't be engaging in that behavior, that unacceptable behavior. The reason why you can't go without your safety equipment is ... The reason why you're not allowed to walk in this part of the factory is ... The reason why you have, it doesn't matter what it is. The reason is this. The explanation is this. This is where orientation and training come in, and they're so critical when you're bringing an employee into a new job or into a new area or working with new people, to explain to them why they're being asked to do what they're being asked to do and why they mustn't engage in behaviors that would be negative or cause problems. Now, we use different schedules to reinforce. This is where you need to turn to your text, page 89. Take a look at table 6.1. Two different kinds of reinforcement. One is continuous. This is every single time that somebody does something the way we want them to do, they do a good thing, we're going to reinforce them every single time. So every time they say something positive, we're going to praise them. Every time they interact with a customer in the correct fashion, we're going to praise them. What this will do is it'll lead to pretty quick learning. But if you want long-term learning, as opposed to just quick, I learned it quickly, but then I forgot, and so I needed to be reinforced again, and then I learned it quickly, and then I forgot. If you want somebody to learn something for the long term, you need to use what's called intermittent reinforcement, which is sporadically. So not every single time. You don't praise someone every single time they do something well. Instead, you do it intermittently or sporadically. Some important terms: you can do this on a fixed or a variable schedule. Fixed is predetermined, every week, every 2 weeks, every month. Variable is as it happens, when it seems appropriate. Interval is all about thinking about time, and ratio is all about thinking about number of responses. So let's put these things together in a table. So in your lecture outline, the next two slides, this and the next slide, are all one table, and I've just split it up so that it looks okay on our slides. So we start with a focus first on interval. Interval is all about time. So a fixed or predetermined amount of time. That is the most common way that people try to reinforce. It's also the least effective. So as it says in the second column, the reinforcement is given at a predetermined period of time. For example, you get your weekly paycheck, you get an annual raise. The effect on behavior tends to be moderate, some level of irregularity in the performance, and people tend to forget. They don't necessarily acquaint the reinforcement with the behavior. For example, most of us, when we get our paycheck, don't necessarily associate our paycheck, especially if it's just a fixed amount, week after week, month after month. We don't really associate it with the particulars of our performance. Variable interval says, okay, we're still interested in time, but it's not going to be fixed. So that reinforcement is given after a randomly distributed length of time. So a person suddenly gets an afternoon off with pay for having finished a project, for having been especially cooperative or collaborative, for having come up with a brilliant idea. So we give them Friday afternoon off with pay. This will lead to moderately high and stable performance, but the unlearning is a bit slower. Now, even better than using interval reinforcement schedules, using ratio schedules. So a fixed ratio, again, predetermined, so the reinforcement is given after a fixed or predetermined number of proper responses. So you might think about when people are doing piecework. So for every piece of something that they finish producing, they are getting payment, let's say, or some other kind of reinforcer, or when they meet sales quotas that lead to a bonus. The effect on behavior is typically we'll get high and stable performance. It'll happen pretty quickly, but so does the unlearning. So as soon as people are excited, they're making as many pieces as they can, and it's all fantastic, but over time that starts to kind of lose its luster. Now the last one, variable ratio, again, not predetermined and not based on time, but rather on the number of responses. This is the least common in organizations, but it in fact is the most effective kind of reinforcement. So we try to randomly, after some random number of responses, we reinforce people. So they've done something right X number of times, and the next time it could be Y number of times, and the next time it could be Z number of times. In other words, that number is changing, and then we reinforce. So it's like playing a video game. You just never really know when, or after you've done so many things, after how many things do I need to do in order to get the prize? Well, last time it was I had to do it 10 times. This time maybe I have to do it 12 times, but you don't know. It's random to the recipient. This is why slot machines are so incredibly effective. You don't really know how many times you need to push the button before, wow, the machine pays out. This leads to very high performance, and unlearning is incredibly rare. You get hooked, basically, addicted, basically, and Now the behavior is what we call second nature. You just do it. Okay, that's the end of part 1. You'll have to listen to the video or watch the narrated PowerPoint for part 2 to catch the rest of chapter 6. Thanks.